Other high-profile people, including Elton John, have been ordered to pay the publisher of the Daily Mail $13 million after losing a high-stakes case against them last month. The group alleged the paper engaged in unlawful information gathering for stories. The court's ruling stated the payment is only an initial sum, not the full total the group will eventually pay. How much is still to be determined. CNN is also learning that Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, may be trying to make an acting comeback. The Duchess is in talks to possibly join the third season of Guy Ritchie's The Gentleman, which shoots in the United Kingdom, according to a person familiar with the discussions. While talks are ongoing, there's no deal in place, and the show hasn't officially been renewed for a third season. This comes, of course, on the heels of the couple's announcement this week that they would be moving their family back to the UK after 6 years of living in California. They're expected to live just outside London, and their children, Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet, are reportedly already enrolled in British schools for the coming term. The news continues right here on CNN.
Hello and welcome to our viewers joining us in the U.S. and all around the world. I'm Sam Abdulaziz in London. Let's go straight to those headlines. Donald Trump is putting the weight of his personal endorsement to the test. Why he went all the way to South Carolina to stump for a runoff race. Plus, the construction at the White House can continue for now. We're going to break down the latest ruling from the Supreme Court. And the defense rests in the murder trial of Lindsay Clancy. What's next for the mother who admits to killing her children?
Live from London, this is CNN Newsroom with Sama Abdulaziz.
I want to start this hour with a trade war between the U.S. and Canada that has just been reignited. A deadline for a new deal passed a few hours ago, with neither side ceding to give ground. This means 50% U.S. tariffs on some $20 billion in Canadian goods are now in effect. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says he suspended the talks in Washington and that Canada will now match those new U.S. tariffs, quote, dollar for dollar. He added, progress has not been enough to meet our objectives for Canadians. Last-minute changes in the U.S. proposed terms were unfair, uneconomic, and called into question the reliability of any deal. The U.S. immediately labeled the collapsed talks as a missed opportunity for Canada. In a statement, the U.S. Trade Representative's office blamed Canada for walking back earlier commitments, making new demands, and retaliating against the U.S. President Trump is back at the White House. This is after traveling to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina on Friday to stump for Darlene Graham, sister, of course, of the late Senator Lindsey Graham. She's already serving out the remainder of her brother's term, but in a runoff on Tuesday, state Republicans will decide whether she will be the GOP Senate candidate on the ballot this November. Graham is leaning into her position as a political outsider.
I am many things, a problem solver, a mother, a leader, but I am not a career politician. I will take the South Carolina conservative values I learned in the back of that liquor store and beer joint with me to Washington. South Carolina needs a fighter. I will fight like hell against the Democrat socialists trying to destroy this country.
Friday's event was a rare campaign style appearance for the president who has a lot on the line since some of his endorsed candidates recently lost the primary. Betsy Klein has more.
President Trump was remarkably on message here in Myrtle Beach ahead of South Carolina's Tuesday runoff election. Folks I've talked to have been very clear-eyed that this is going to be a very tight race. It's going to be a matter of turnout. And President Trump did his job tonight. He praised Darlene Graham. He encouraged voters to get out and to pretend that his name was on the ballot on Tuesday. He also touched on some of the nuts and bolts, that polls are open 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. But it also had all the hallmarks of a standard Trump rally. The president touted his ballroom project. He touched on the war with Iran, which he described as a little detour. He blamed inflation on the Democrats, took aim at Democratic socialists, as well as old rivals like Hillary Clinton and former President Joe Biden. He also just kept coming back to Darlene Graham.
We're going to elect Senator Darlene Graham to fight for South Carolina and to always put America first. She only knows how to put America first. She will be somebody you're going to be very proud. If you vote for her, you're going to be very proud of that vote. The first step is winning the runoff election this Tuesday. You have to get out August 25th. You have to get out and vote. And we need every South Carolina patriot to go to the polls and vote for Darlene Graham.
This race is causing divisions among South Carolina Republicans as well as President Trump's own allies. But the president remains all in on Darlene Graham. Behind the scenes, President Steve acknowledges they have a lot on the line on Tuesday, especially after some of the president's endorsed candidates have failed to win their primary. The president making calls privately to garner support for Graham. He was asked about the debate gap last week where she said national security is not her thing. The president doubling down on his support. He said that this was just Graham being honest. It's also very personal for the president. Lindsey Graham was one of his best friends, and he said he was doing this to honor Lindsey. But of course, South Carolina is not a battleground state, and some are questioning whether this is the best use of the president's time with just 2 months to go before those midterm elections. Betsy Klein, CNN, traveling with the president in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
I want to bring in now Luis Alfredo Garcia. He is a news reporter with South Carolina ETV and Public Radio. He joins us now live from Columbia, South Carolina. Thank you, first of all, for coming to us in the middle of your night after, well, a very electric campaign rally. I know you were there. I know that you got a sense of the atmosphere of the crowd. Just set the scene for me. Take me there.
Right, so the doors opened at about 3 p.m. President Trump, he wasn't set to speak until around 7 p.m. And I mean, it was swerving. There were metal detectors. People were trying to fight for a seat, essentially. Not actually fighting, but you know, everyone was excited. They were excited to see the president. And here from Darlene Graham, I spoke to a lot of voters who simply wanted to hear more from her. You know, she has the endorsement of President Donald Trump, the endorsement of Congressman Russell Fry, who represents South Carolina's 7th District. Myrtle Beach is in the 7th District. But they wanted to see for themselves, hear from themselves what Graham had to say. And I spoke to some voters who were convinced, some voters who still wanted to do a little more research before Tuesday. But the vibe in the room was overall very cheery. As you can see, it was a very, very rumptious event.
You talk about speaking to some of the voters that were at that campaign rally, and you give me the sense that some of them are still doing their research. Tell me what mattered to those voters. Is it keeping the Graham name? Is it the legacy of it? Is it the Trump endorsement? Or are there issues in the state of South Carolina?
Well, the people of South Carolina, a lot of the voters I talked to, they value a lot of, conservative values that are in the news right now. They value an anti-abortion stance. They value a strong anti-immigration stance. But as far as the Graham legacy, a lot of voters are just conservative that they valued Lindsey Graham's time in the U.S. Senate in South Carolina. Spent more than 20 years there. But they said that wasn't holding as much weight, and neither was the endorsement from President Donald Trump. President Donald Trump is popular in South Carolina, but a lot of people look more at their local officials or their state officials when it comes to, helping make a selection. And then, of course, they from there do their own research, whether that's watching the debate that was Tuesday before this Friday rally, or just, going online and researching about the actual candidates. They want to see South Carolina improve, and so although a lot of people are talking about what she said about national security on Tuesday, to a lot of people it's more so something that it isn't going to impact them directly. They want to see something in South Carolina impacted, and so that might not hold as much weight for some people as others.
It's very interesting that you said, just from chatting to people one-on-one, it wasn't about the Graham legacy, it wasn't about President Trump's endorsement, but for President Trump, it is very much about that endorsement. He kept sort of repeating this line of, pretend I'm the one on the ballot, I'm the one on the ballot. He has invested so much personally in Darlene Graham's campaign. How much trouble is she in ahead of Tuesday's runoff against Congressman Ralph Norman, and what might it tell us about President Trump if she doesn't win?
We still don't really know what's going to happen. About 64,000 people voted so far through early voting, so people still have an opportunity to show up on Tuesday. But I mean, Senator Darlene Graham, a lot of people just aren't familiar with her, so if she were to win, that would mean a lot for the Trump endorsement. 2 hours before Trump spoke at 7 p.m., so at around 5 p.m., South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster endorsed Darlene Graham pretty late into the race, but it seems like a lot of people are pushing behind Darlene Graham, and so this test against Congressman Ralph Norman, it's going to be a true test to see where South Carolinians lie when it comes to the Trump endorsement and how much weight it holds in the state.
And I think while there's been questions about whether or not President Trump should be putting so much effort, so much time, so much energy when you're talking about the Republican primaries, on the counter side, on the counter argument, several Trump-backed candidates have recently fallen short in their primaries. How significant of a test is this? Does it tell us more about President Trump's ability to endorse ahead of those midterms and limited positions?
Well, I think a little bit, but this is also a very, not strange case, it's a very specific case. Lindsey Graham, House Democrats died on July 11th, the August 11th primary was one month later, so people were really working on an expedited timeline. This was a Trump endorsement that came before Senator Darlene Graham even joined the event. He talked at the rally about how he encouraged her to run, about how he wanted to see her run, and eventually she did run, and she did get the endorsement from him and a bunch of other state leaders. So this is going to be a test. I mean, it's really for a lot of people who did not know who Darlene Graham was before this race was happening. They just realized they were Graham's sister. And so this is a pretty big test of the endorsement, especially because for a lot of people, the endorsement was the first time they were really hearing about Darlene Graham or her appointment from Governor Henry McMaster to the Senate.
You smile a little, simple joy.
Luis Alfredo Garcia in Columbia, South Carolina, on what South Carolinians want and what President Trump wants out of that runoff. Thank you so much. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is vowing a response. This is after a very devastating Russian attack on a shopping center. Ukrainian officials say a double-tap drone strike has killed some 16 people and wounded at least 139. Video shows a drone hitting a shopping center in central Ukraine and bursting into flames. Smoke from an apparent earlier strike is still visible in the background. President Zelensky says a second wave of drones targeted emergency crews. This was just half an hour after that initial strike. I want to go now to Sebastian Shukla. He is standing by for us live from Berlin. Seb, just talk me through what's happening now. These rescue operations still ongoing. What are you learning about the
So the victim, Salma, sadly was risen from overnight to 16 people, with 130 still seriously injured, 23 of those being children. We know that the emergency services worked through the night, through the wreckage to try and save anybody else or find other victims. This attack, Salma, though, can be described as nothing else other than callous. A double tap is not something that we see that often in Ukraine, but is a tactic that the Russian armed forces used quite extensively in Syria, and effectively what it does is hit a target initially, cause damage, cause casualties, and then, as President Zelensky said, 30 minutes later, another projectile is fired towards the same target after the emergency services have arrived, and it then just inflicts further wounds. It really is a morally repugnant tactic to use, Salma, and take a listen to what President Zelensky had to say about it and what he vowed the response from Ukraine to be.
This is an absolute atrocity committed by the Russians. They're nothing but beasts. We will definitely respond. It's crucial that we have everything we need to protect lives. It is important that the world does not remain silent about this. This Russian war has come to an end. The world must help us achieve
I'll add that this mall, Salma, was in President Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rih, but he mentioned there about trying to end this war altogether. I see no real prospects for that at the moment, because overnight Ukraine fired drones towards Russia, this time Russian-style Amazon. It's known as ozon, which is the same as those wild berries. It's largely an e-commerce platform that Russians use to buy goods. Amazon is the most direct example of that. But equally, Russia has fired missiles towards Kyiv, the capital city, and also Odessa overnight. And what I think we're seeing here, although that these airstrikes have been something that is now the common, almost daily circumstances both in Ukraine and Russia, is a very dangerous situation here of an escalatory phase, because as we saw with that mall in Kryvyi Rih, that is almost certainly only a civilian target, but equally the Russians look like they're prepared to continue to hit, and the Ukrainians are also widening the scope very slightly from purely military targets or industrial, that could be oil refineries and military bases, to hitting these logistics depots and warehouses. And there is no sign, Salma, yet that this war is going to be brought to an end anytime soon. Talks have broken down between the US and Russia. We have no idea if there will be visits by the administration to Moscow or to Kyiv. And most importantly, President Putin is showing no signs yet that any of the attacks brought by Ukraine are hurting himself or the economy or the Russian people are really starting to feel this. And as we go into the winter, Salma, this could be the new wave and style of this war, and it's a very, very dangerous one. Salma.
Sebastian Shukla there on a double-top attack that may indicate a worrying turn, a more brutal turn in that conflict. President Trump's latest threat of an economic D-Day against Tehran is now being condemned by China and Iran. Beijing says new sanctions do not fit the interest of either party. China's foreign ministry says sanctions and pressure tactics are not the solution to ending the war and urged both sides to return to peace talks. Iran, for its part, says new sanctions would be unlawful and pave the way to, quote, a return to full-scale classic colonialism. Earlier this week, President Trump threatened to pressure economic cooperation against Iran in a social media post. He warned of the economic consequences for any countries that continue to do business with him. Here's what he told reporters on Friday about this.
We have total control, as you know, of the border. We have total control. If you look at the blockade, we have total control of that entire region having to do with the Strait of Hormuz. And that means well into the land area. So they would love to make a deal, but they're not ready to make the right deal, in my opinion.
Now, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier urged Beijing to, quote, get with the program. China provides crucial economic support for Iran, but has walked this very cautious diplomatic line during the conflict. Meanwhile, shipping traffic in the Strait of Hormuz has increased this week, reaching about 20% of the pre-war weekly average. According to the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, 103 ships entered the strait and 89 left in critical water. President Trump gets a temporary green light from the Supreme Court to continue the construction of his very controversial ballroom. After the break, why the Chief Justice stepped in and what comes next in the legal fight over the project. Plus, what the president is now saying about the new U.S. Treasury buyback plan. Who's behind it? Stay with us.
After my accident,
of President Trump's controversial White House ballroom to continue, that is for now. On Friday, Chief Justice John Roberts blocked a lower court ruling that would have halted the work. CNN senior White House reporter Kevin Liptak has more for us.
President Trump scored a victory at the Supreme Court on Friday when the panel ruled that construction on his ballroom could continue. Now, this was a temporary victory. They did not rule on the legality of the construction, but they have said that they need more time to deliberate on those particular points, and they will allow the construction to continue while they continue to do that. Now, President Trump is touting this as a major win. He said that he was, quote, grateful for the decision of the United States Supreme Court, and he says that, quote, the military/ballroom complex being built on the hallowed grounds of the White House, which is so vital to national security, will be the greatest of its kind. Now, you'll remember, two lower courts had ruled that construction was illegal because the White House didn't have the authority to make this large a change to the White House grounds, and they said that it would require Congress for construction to continue. What the White House argued is that essentially it was too far gone, that because the ballroom was 65% complete, that they had already built 5 stories below ground and 70 feet in the air, that essentially it was too late to stop the construction now. Now, President Trump has been traveling in South Carolina on a campaign swing. He also mentioned this victory. Here's what he said.
I'm in a very good mood tonight. I didn't mention this to Darlene because today we just learned that the big decision of the United States Supreme Court came down and the military/ballroom, this beautiful, magnificent complex, being built on the hallowed grounds of our cherished White House, which is so vital for national security, it's going to be the greatest of its kind anywhere that's ever been built, and it's something that presidents have wanted to be built for over 150 years.
So you hear there, President Trump using the ballroom during a campaign stop. It's not clear how much this issue is swaying voters. If anything, many voters say that the president is overly focused on these projects and not necessarily on what they're focused on, namely on the economy. So this construction will continue. The court continues to debate and deliberate over what exactly the legalities of all of this is, but at least for now, that ballroom still continues. Kevin Lachak, CNN, White House.
The U.S. Justice Department has reached a $400 million settlement with TikTok and internet companies, the latest settlement in a wave of lawsuits that harm children by social media giants. The Justice Department sued TikTok as well for claiming the app failed to stop children from joining and illegally collected their personal data. TikTok said back then that many of the allegations, quote, relate to past events and practices that are factually inaccurate or have already been addressed. President Donald Trump says he had nothing to do with the U.S. Treasury buyback plan that was announced this week.
Did you direct Secretary Besson to intervene in the bond market?
No, not at all. No, he's a very capable man. He wanted to do it. He's very good at it. He has a good touch, very good natural touch for the bonds and interest, and he did that.
The Treasury Department said Wednesday it was doubling planned purchases of longer-term bonds to try and lower borrowing costs. Treasury yields fell sharply and stocks rallied, but the effort provided only temporary relief. Yields rose again a day later, returning to roughly where they were before the buyback announcement. CNN's David Gold explains.
The bond market is in the news this week, and I think that it's important that we understand why it affects you. So the government does all kinds of things that we want it to do with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, but now the government decides it wants to go to war. Well, that's very expensive, and to fund that, it's going to have to borrow. Now, we already know that the war has raised gas prices, but now, since interest rates that maybe were around 4%, well, taking on more risk, investors say, you know what, we want those to be higher, maybe around 5%. So then the government needs to pay for all of this, but so do you, because when treasuries go higher, then so do the consumer loans that are pegged to those treasuries, like mortgages, credit cards, auto loans. All of those get more expensive. It's not the only way that it affects you, though, because the government says, well, if we need to pay more money to finance that debt, then we have to make some tough decisions. And we saw this week that we now have $40 trillion in debt, and to finance that debt, just to pay for that, it's going to cost $1.2 trillion this year alone. That is 19% of the federal budget. That is basically saying a fifth of all the money the government spends just goes to finance the debt that is intended to borrow to all of the expenses. So what is going to be reduced in some way, or Medicare or Medicaid. And we have seen some of these social services start to fray a little bit. Not all of the options that we had before continue to be options going forward. So these are painful options, and this, I think, explains how the debt market and the bond market affects you at home. So what's getting done about it? Well, the Treasury is trying to intervene by buying back some of these bonds to lower those rates. Problem is it's just a drop in the bucket. With a market this size, it's going to take a lot of action to get those yields lower. Right now, it's a painful thing to get done, and it's causing a lot of pain to the people at home.
He spent years talking about the night Tupac Shakur was killed back in 1996. Now defendant Dwayne Davis's own words are taking center stage in his Las Vegas murder trial. We're going to have the latest from court right after the break. Also, Lindsay Clancy's defense team rests its case as prosecutors call rebuttal witnesses. Ahead, what a forensic psychiatrist had to say about the series.
Stop the itch sanity with cortisone 10 for bug bites, poison ivy, and other itch.
Welcome back. I'm Salma Abdulaziz. Let's check some of today's top stories. 50% U.S. tariffs on some $20 billion worth of Canadian goods are now in effect after a Saturday morning deadline passed and Canada suspended trade talks with the U.S.-Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. He said in a statement late Friday that Canada will match the U.S. tariffs, quote, dollar for dollar. Iran is pushing back against President Trump's threat of an economic D-Day. Iran's foreign ministry says new sanctions would pave the way for a return to full-scale classic colonialism. President Trump had earlier threatened a crushing economic operation against Iran. He also warned there would be economic consequences for countries that continue to do business with Tehran. Ukrainian officials say a Russian double-tap strike on a shopping center has killed at least 16 people and wounded at least 130 others. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says a second wave of drones targeted emergency crews just half an hour after that initial strike. Authorities in Sweden say an 18-year-old armed with a sword has killed a student at a high school. This attack happened on Friday. Two teenage boys were also severely injured. A third was treated at a hospital and later released. For some students, it was their first day back at school since summer recess. After the attack, school went into lockdown.
Yeah, so you don't take well. We've been locked in for 5 hours. At first, it was just a completely normal day. But then I saw a guy who had blood all over his brain, or on his back at least. And then I saw the police and everyone else around me. The teachers told us we had to stay put, and we didn't know for how long.
We say the attacker was a former student at the school who was shot. Dwayne Davis, the man accused of orchestrating the 1996 murder of rapper Tupac Shakur, spoke out in court on Friday. In a very heated moment, Davis addressed the judge after jurors left for a lunch break, accusing prosecutors of endangering his family by revealing his home address. Davis claimed his home and family have been repeatedly targeted by vandals. Later, Davis's attorney declined to give details about those alleged incidents. CNN's Josh Campbell has more on this trial.
Week one of the trial of the man accused of taking part in the murder of legendary rapper Tupac Shakur is complete, and the star witness so far, the defendant's own words. Dwayne Davis says pleaded not guilty to allegations that he helped orchestrate Shakur's killing. In a 2008 police interview, prosecutors played for the jury. Davis claimed the shooting of Shakur and rapper Mr. Suge Knight near the Las Vegas Strip 30 years ago was done out of retribution. Davis said his nephew, Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, had been beaten up earlier that night on the Shakur's entourage. Hours later, Davis, Baby Lane, and 2 others spotted Shakur at night driving up on foot. A Las Vegas medical examiner testified about the wounds Shakur received.
He died of gunshot wounds of chest and abdomen.
And do you have an opinion as to the manner of death?
Yes.
What is that?
Homicide.
The jury also viewed video clips from a 2018 documentary entitled Death Row Chronicles. Davis was interviewed for the show and provided a moment-by-moment explanation of how the shooting happened, while a recreated dramatization was displayed on screen.
Hold up. I was in the front seat. I haven't seen my friend.
You said the shots came from the back. Big Dre, Orlando, shot. Two
Keep it cold in the streets. It just came from the back seat.
In his police interview, Davis also claimed that disgraced rapper Sean Diddy Combs offered a $1 million bounty to have Shakur and Knight killed, allegations that Combs has repeatedly denied. He has not been charged in connection with this case. Now, despite past comments by Davis describing his role in the shooting, he and his attorney now claim he made it all up and was merely trying to make money off of his stories. There's a major question that will decide his fate. Which version of the story will the jury ultimately believe? The trial is expected to last several more weeks. Back to you.
Three teens pictured with Norman Wells before his death are threatening to sue Reverend Al Sharpton. Attorneys for Morgan Seymour, Jack Spitalo, and Warren Hudson sent a pre-suit demand letter on Friday. The letter accuses Sharpton of making defamatory statements about them and demands an apology. Pre-suit letters are an attempt to resolve issues before a lawsuit is filed. Now, Sharpton says he welcomes the threat of a lawsuit. The civil rights leader delivered an eulogy at Wells's funeral. The 18-year-old was found dead on Horn Island off the Mississippi coast. This was following a July 4th trip with his friends. The circumstances surrounding his death are currently under investigation. Lindsay Clancy's defense team has rested its case after calling him innocent. Prosecutors accuse Clancy of killing the teacher, but her attorney says she should not be held responsible because she was suffering from postpartum psychosis. CNN's Greg Grass has more on the sharply different assessments of Clancy's mental state.
So before the defense arrested maybe their most important witness took the stand, Philip Resnick, a forensic psychiatrist. Now, he basically has made an entire career testifying in high-profile murder cases. We're talking about the Unabomber, we're talking about Casey Anthony, Andrea Yates. Of course, that name probably draws no similarity to the Lindsay Clancy case. In fact, the defense submitted his resume 40 pages long to the jury, almost to say to them, listen, you need to listen to the testimony of this witness, because he essentially testified that Lindsay was going through a psychotic break during the time that she killed her children back in January 2023, and that is the crux of the defense's case. I want you to hear what he testified to jurors, what he said.
She had what is known as a delusion of influence. That is, not only did she hear a command, but she felt that her body was taken over by an external force, where she was in a dream state and did not have control of her own body. It was almost like she was a puppet and someone else was pulling the strings.
And when it was the prosecution's turn to cross-examine Resnick, essentially they continued to try to poke holes into the defense's case, of course, but basically questioning why, if Lindsay was hearing voices or she was receiving these commands, how come there was no documents of that in any of her medical records? How come she didn't tell anybody that, any doctors, therapists, any of the medical professionals that she got help from? How come they never wrote that down? So that is a continuing theme that we have heard from the prosecution's case, and so that was something that they tried to bring out of this witness as well. Okay, here's where we stand on this trial. The prosecution ended Friday with a rebuttal witness. Defense was cross-examining by the time the day was over, but we're expecting the prosecution to call at least 2 more rebuttal witnesses before this entire trial wraps up, and then of course the opposing arguments, and then the jury should get the case. So we do expect all of that to happen at the start of next week, and the jury might have this case in their hands as early as Tuesday, maybe even Wednesday. Rinjing Grass, CNN, New York.
A massive here in the UK has now ruled that Prince Harry, Elton John, and other high-profile figures will have to pay $13 million for legal costs of a British tabloid publisher who lost the case against the publisher of the Daily Mail last month. They had accused the tabloid of using unlawful information gathering for stories unpublished in it. The court ruled Prince Harry and the others must pay the initial purchase by a full estimated legal cost about $47 million. Publisher, of course, at least one of the high-profile things considering whether to appeal the cost of judgment. Prince Harry and his wife, the Duchess of Sussex, made a very surprising announcement this week to reveal that they're moving out of them back to England with the
Big news here in Hollywood and also across the pond. Just days after CNN reported that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were moving their family back to the UK out of California, it appears that Meghan Markle could also be making her big return to acting. A source familiar with current discussions tells me that Meghan Markle is in talks to join the third season of Guy Ritchie's Netflix series, The Gentleman. Now, no deal is in place, and Deadline, which is the Hollywood trade that first reported the news that Meghan had gotten an offer to join the show, they report that, quote, the conversations are hypothetical at this point. They also noted that no specific role has been identified for Markle so far, so it is possible that this doesn't happen, but if it does, it would make a lot of sense because the ex-royal couple, they of course have a relationship with Netflix. Netflix is where they did their big docuseries about that relationship, and it's also where Meghan Markle has hosted 2 seasons of her own lifestyle series. Now, this would be the first major role since before Meghan joined the royal family and since her and Prince Harry have left the royal family. That role, of course, was in the series Suits. Now, Netflix declined to comment on my reporting, and I have reached out to multiple representatives for Meghan Markle and her production. Back to you.
Another White House official is promoting a new YouTube show. What drove the U.S. Transportation Secretary to start his program and why controversy now surrounds Sean Duffy, the MTV star turned U.S. Transportation Secretary, has come to defense about his reaction to that follows the Trump cabinet secretary, his wife, Fox host Duffy, and their 9 children as they travel throughout the U.S.
The Great American Road Trip wasted no time getting to a hot button issue for President Donald Trump. I say you got
He was pushing us to actually have a
Discussing college choices with a teenage daughter, the transportation secretary quickly slaps down her dream of going to Harvard as inconsistent with the family's faith.
If I send you there, I think what happens is they have professionalized figuring out how they can take good young girls like you and I think corrupt their minds.
Harvard has been a disaster.
That fits into President Trump's long legal and policy battles with the school.
Catholicism, to us, is everything.
And the secretary's new editorial on the subject dovetails with the steady push of religion, which appears in every episode of this cabinet member's show.
Let's pray.
Pray.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
But other parts of the programs are far more secular, including this hot take on how to pick a marriage partner.
The key to a good, long-lasting marriage is to marry somebody very good-looking that you're attracted to, because marriage involves a lot of forgiveness. And it's easier to forgive someone when you're very attracted to them.
What's up, Team Boeing?
Hey, welcome! The series, which the Transportation Department says is privately funded, was already drawing fire earlier this year from some Democratic members of Congress, since some of that money came from companies including Boeing, which has faced serious questions since being featured in the show.
I don't like the fact that it was paid for by companies that you have to oversee, companies that you work with.
What's more, amid rising concern about air safety and soaring gas prices, the whole idea of the secretary making a reality series has struck some critics as a wobbly field.
This show is incredibly out of touch with where Americans are.
And viewership is another problem. Going into this weekend, all 6 parts of this series combined on YouTube where they were posted had been viewed fewer than 20,000 times. It's a very low number that perhaps wasn't helped by the fact that it was originally supposed to come out in June to push families to travel to center and see the country then, but it was late. It came out this week, just as most kids were going to see.
It's week 2 of the NFL preseason as the New York Jets crushed the Pittsburgh Steelers 17-0 in their preseason game last night. But the quarterback Smith is back with the team that drafted him in 2013. He completed all 7 of his passes on his only drive for 65 yards and a touchdown. Meanwhile, the Green Bay Packers defeated the Denver Broncos 32-13. Despite the loss, Broncos quarterback Joe Mix made a successful return from a broken ankle, completing 6 of 9 passes for 76 yards. For millions of football fans, one of the biggest weekends of the season is upon us, and the NFL hasn't picked up yet. It's draft weekend for fantasy football. Fans draft real NFL players, quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, kickers to build their dream team. Then they earn points based on how those players perform in real NFL games. Some fantasy leagues play for cash, while others have creative penalties for finishing last. Earlier, CNN spoke with Hayden Winks, co-host of the podcast Yahoo Fantasy Football with Josh and Hayden, and got some tips on building a competitive fantasy team.
Usually your league is about 10 to 12 people in the league. There's probably about 16 to 18 quarterbacks that are generally available, so you can wait, and there's a lot of like big names, Patrick Mahomes, and then with the running backs, that's where I think there's more of a cliff this year, where there's about 15 guys that I trust, and then the rest of the group I really don't trust. So draft your running backs, draft your wide receivers early on, then wait for a kicker, wait for defense, wait for your quarterback. But the quarterback one is the biggest thing.
Thank you for watching. I'm Salma Abdulaziz. For our viewers in North America, CNN This Morning is coming up next. For the rest of the world, it will be African.